October 12, 2015. Pinewood Springs, Texas, a town where everyone knew their neighbors, where the high school football games were community events, and where serious crime was something that happened in bigger cities, not here. That changed when 17-year-old Madeline Taylor didn't return home from her after-school study session at the local library. The initial response followed the standard pattern for a missing teenager. Parents calling friends, friends saying they hadn't seen her since school let out, then a reluctant call to the police station. Officer Ben Reeves took the report, noting that teens often stayed out without calling, but something in Mrs. Taylor's voice, a mother's intuition perhaps, prompted him to escalate the case more quickly than usual. Madeline was a model student at Pinewood Springs High School. She maintained a 4. Her zero GPA was active in the debate team and had already received early acceptance letters from 3 prestigious universities. Her disappearance made no sense to those who knew her. She wouldn't just leave, her mother insisted during the first press conference, held just 48 hours after Madeline was reported missing. Something happened to my daughter. The search began methodically. First, the route between the library and the Taylor home, a 20-minute walk that Madeline had made hundreds of times before. Security camera footage from the library confirmed she had left at 6:43 p.m., her backpack slung over one shoulder, her distinctive red jacket making her easy to spot on the grainy footage. But after she walked out of frame, Madeline Taylor seemed to vanish into the cool autumn air. Local volunteers formed search parties. They combed through the small wooded area that separated the library from the residential neighborhood where the Taylors lived. They checked abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. Divers even searched the retention pond near the community center, though there was no evidence suggesting Madeline had gone anywhere near water that evening. 3 days into the investigation, Detective Sarah Morales from the Harris County Sheriff's Department took over the case. She brought with her a team specialized in missing persons cases and a more systematic approach. They interviewed Madeline's teachers, her classmates, and re-interviewed her closest friends. One name that repeatedly appeared in these interviews was that of Devon Pierce, Madeline's chemistry teacher. By all accounts, Pierce was one of the most popular teachers at Pinewood Springs High, charismatic, engaging, and known for making difficult concepts accessible to his students. He had been Madeline's chemistry teacher for 2 years and was now her advanced placement instructor. According to her friends, Madeline often stayed after class to discuss concepts or potential science fair projects. Mr. Pierce always made time for students who wanted to learn more, said the school principal Howard Gardner during his interview. He's the kind of teacher who changes lives. When questioned, Pierce appeared appropriately concerned about his missing student. He provided investigators with what seemed like helpful information about Madeline's state of mind in the days before her disappearance. She seemed a bit distracted in class that week, he told Detective Morales. I asked if everything was okay, and she mentioned she was feeling pressure about college applications. That's normal for seniors, especially the high achievers. Pierce's statement aligned with what others had said about Madeline's increased stress levels as college decision deadlines approached. He had a solid alibi for the evening of the disappearance. He was at a school board meeting until 7:30 p.m., with dozens of witnesses confirming his presence. Detective Morales made a note in her file and moved on to other leads. The investigation continued for weeks, then months. Madeline's face appeared on flyers throughout the county, on local news broadcasts, and eventually on a national missing persons database. The FBI briefly consulted on the case, but found no evidence of interstate trafficking or abduction across state lines that would bring the case under federal jurisdiction. As winter approached, the active search scaled back. The media attention dwindled. New cases demanded the department's limited resources. Detective Morales remained committed, checking in with the Taylor family regularly, following up on the occasional tip that came in, but the leads grew cold. In January 2016, Mrs. Taylor made a tearful plea on local television, begging for anyone with information to come forward. The broadcast generated a brief flurry of calls to the tip line, but nothing substantive emerged. By March, Detective Morales was assigned to a new case, a double homicide in a neighboring town that demanded immediate attention. While she didn't officially close Madeline's case, her active involvement necessarily decreased. In July 2016, the Harris County Sheriff's Department officially classified Madeline Taylor's case as cold but open. The file was transferred to the department's cold case unit, where it joined dozens of other unsolved disappearances and murders, cases that remained open in technical terms, but rarely received active investigation hours. Life in Pinewood Springs gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the Taylor family never stopped searching. They established a scholarship in Madeline's name. They maintained a website with her information and hired private investigators when they could afford to. Mr. Taylor's health began to deteriorate, with his doctor attributing his heart problems to the stress of not knowing what happened to his daughter. Meanwhile, Devon Pierce continued teaching at Pinewood Springs High School. In 2018, he was named department chair for the science program. In 2020, he received the county's Educator of the Year award, with the local newspaper featuring a front-page story about his innovative teaching methods and dedication to his students. The article mentioned that Pierce had declined opportunities to teach at larger schools or universities, preferring to remain in the community where he had built his career. "These kids are my life," Pierce was quoted saying. "I can't imagine being anywhere else." By October 2021, Madeline Taylor would have been 23 years old, possibly a college graduate starting her career or continuing to graduate school. Instead, her case sat in a storage room at the Harris County Sheriff's Department, the cardboard box containing her file growing dusty and faded, one of many unsolved mysteries that haunted the community. Then, on a rainy January morning in 2023, more than 7 years after Madeline's disappearance, Detective Raul Dominguez, newly transferred to the cold case unit, arrived at his desk to find a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note that would change everything. The photograph showed a purple backpack with distinctive pins and patches, the same backpack Madeline Taylor had been carrying the day she disappeared. The note, written in careful block letters, contained just 3 sentences. "Check the chemistry teacher's property on Lake Travis. He buried more than just his past out there. Some things don't stay buried forever." Detective Dominguez stared at the photograph for a long moment before pulling Madeline Taylor's file from storage. As he read through the case notes, a chill ran down his spine. This anonymous tip wasn't just reopening a cold case, it was pointing directly at someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Detective Raul Dominguez was no stranger to cold cases. In his 15 years with law enforcement, he'd seen how time could both erode evidence and reveal new truths. But there was something about the Madeline Taylor file that kept him at his desk long after his shift had ended that January evening. The anonymous letter felt different from the usual tips that occasionally trickled in on old cases. Most were vague recollections or second-hand rumors, but this was specific. The photograph of Madeline's backpack wasn't publicly available. It matched the description in the case file down to the NASA patch and the hand-sewn rainbow heart that Mrs. Taylor had mentioned in her initial report. Dominguez carefully placed the photograph in an evidence bag and logged it into the system. Protocol demanded he verify Devon Pierce still lived in the area before pursuing the lead further. A quick database search confirmed that Pierce remained employed at Pinewood Springs High School and owned a 5-acre property near Lake Travis, about 40 minutes from town. The property records showed Pierce had purchased the land in 2013, 2 years before Madeline's disappearance. It was listed as recreational, a weekend getaway with a small cabin, nothing unusual for a teacher with tenure and modest savings. But the anonymous tip suggested there was more to this rural retreat than fishing trips and nature walks. Before approaching Pierce directly, Dominguez needed to build context. He spent the next 3 days immersing himself in the original investigation, reading every interview transcript, reviewing the timeline, and studying the search patterns from 2015. He noticed that while Pierce had been interviewed, the focus on him had been minimal. His alibi for the school board meeting had seemingly removed him from the suspect list early on. "We need to verify that alibi again," Dominguez told his supervisor, Lieutenant Keller, during their morning briefing. The board meeting ended at 7:30 p.m., but Madeline was last seen at 6:43. The library is less than a 10-minute drive from the school. Theoretically, Pierce could have intercepted her and still made it to the meeting. Keller looked skeptical. That's a tight timeline, and there were no signs of struggle at the library or along her route home, which might make sense if she willingly got into a car with someone she trusted, like her teacher, Dominguez countered. The lieutenant sighed, but authorized a discreet reinvestigation. "Keep it quiet. Pierce is practically a local hero now. If you start throwing accusations without solid evidence, the department will face serious blowback." Dominguez's first stop was the school district's administrative office, where he requested the complete attendance record and minutes from the October 12, 2015 board meeting. The records confirmed Pierce was marked present, but interestingly, the minutes showed he didn't contribute to the discussion until an agenda item at 7:45 p.m., more than an hour after the meeting began. Next, Dominguez tracked down Elaine Winters, the board secretary who had taken attendance that night. Now retired, she lived in a small apartment across town. "I remember that meeting," she said when he showed her the minutes. "It was budget review night, always ran long." When Dominguez asked specifically about Pierce's arrival time, her brow furrowed. "You know, now that you mention it, I don't think he was there when I did the initial roll call. I just assumed he was in the restroom or taking a phone call. He definitely spoke during the technology funding discussion, but that was later in the evening." This discrepancy wasn't proof of anything, but it punched a hole in Pierce's alibi, large enough for Dominguez to justify digging deeper. He obtained a warrant to access Pierce's cell phone records from 2015. Technology had advanced significantly since the original investigation, and data that might not have seemed relevant then could tell a different story now. The records revealed something Detective Morales had missed years earlier, or perhaps hadn't had the technology to properly analyze. Between 6:30 p.m. and 7:25 p.m. on the night of Madeleine's disappearance, Pierce's phone had pinged towers in a sequence that suggested movement from the school toward the library area, then out toward the western edge of town, before returning to the school vicinity. His phone had then remained stationary at the school until after 9 p.m. This movement pattern directly contradicted Pierce's statement that he had been at the school preparing for the board meeting from 5:30 p.m. onward. More concerning was the western route. It aligned with the back road leading toward Pierce's Lake Travis property. Dominguez also discovered that 2 days after Madeleine's disappearance, Pierce had requested a substitute teacher for his classes, citing a family emergency. He had been absent for 3 days. According to HR records, this was the only time in his 15-year career at Pinewood Springs that Pierce had taken unexpected leave. Armed with these inconsistencies, Dominguez felt justified in taking the next step. He needed to see the Lake Travis property, but a formal search would require probable cause that would likely alert Pierce. Instead, he obtained permission to conduct surveillance from adjacent public land. For 2 consecutive weekends, Dominguez observed the property through binoculars. Pierce visited both weekends, arriving Friday evening and departing Sunday afternoon. His activities seemed mundane, reading on the porch, walking the perimeter of his land, tending to a small garden. But Dominguez noticed something odd. Despite owning 5 acres, Pierce only utilized the area immediately surrounding the cabin. The rear portion of the property, which sloped down toward a densely wooded area, remained untouched. On the second Sunday after Pierce departed, Dominguez used a drone to legally capture aerial footage of the entire property. The infrared camera revealed something unexpected, a rectangular section of earth behind the tree line that reflected heat differently than the surrounding soil. To an untrained eye, it might appear insignificant, but to Dominguez, it suggested disturbed ground that had settled differently than the natural terrain. This evidence, combined with the cell phone records and the anonymous tip, was enough to secure a search warrant. But before executing it, Dominguez made one more crucial discovery. In reviewing Pierce's personnel file, he found that the teacher had requested a transfer to a school in Austin shortly after Madeleine's disappearance. The request had been denied due to mid-year timing, but he had resubmitted it at the end of the school year. That request was also denied as the principal had fought to keep his star teacher. Pierce had never mentioned these transfer attempts during the original investigation. The pattern was becoming clearer: a possible encounter with Madeleine after the library, unexplained movement toward his rural property, unusual leave immediately after her disappearance, and attempts to relocate away from Pinewood Springs. None of it was definitive proof, but together these elements painted a picture of a man with something to hide. As February began, Dominguez prepared to execute the search warrant on Pierce's Lake Travis property. He assembled a team that included forensic experts, specializing in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. The operation was planned for a Monday, when Pierce would be teaching, minimizing the chance of confrontation. What they would discover beneath the undisturbed soil of that seemingly peaceful retreat would shock even the most seasoned investigators and forever change how Pinewood Springs remembered its beloved teacher. The morning of February 6, 2023, arrived with a biting cold that seemed appropriate for the grim task ahead. Detective Dominguez led a team of 8 specialists to Devon Pierce's Lake Travis property timing their arrival for 8:30 a.m., well after Pierce would have begun his teaching day at Pinewood Springs High School. The property was secluded, accessible only by a winding gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Tall pine trees obscured the cabin from the main road, providing privacy that now felt ominous rather than peaceful. Dominguez had arranged for an unmarked patrol car to maintain surveillance on Pierce at the school, ensuring they would have warning if he unexpectedly left campus. "Let's start with the area behind the tree line," Dominguez instructed the forensic team. The drone footage showed thermal anomalies approximately 200 yards behind the cabin, near the edge of the clearing. Dr. Elisa Reyes, the lead forensic archaeologist, unloaded ground-penetrating radar equipment from their van. "We'll establish a grid pattern and scan methodically," she explained. "If there's anything significant beneath the surface, we'll find it." While the radar team set up their equipment, Dominguez and 2 officers approached the cabin. The search warrant covered the entire property, and the detective was determined to be thorough. The cabin itself was modest, a single-room structure with a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and a sleeping loft. It was meticulously organized, almost sterile in its precision. "Check for any hidden compartments or false walls," Dominguez instructed, "and photograph everything before we move it." The cabin search revealed little of immediate interest, some academic journals, fishing equipment, and basic supplies. However, in a drawer beneath the bed, Officer Chen discovered a locked metal box. When they pried it open, they found a collection of newspaper clippings about Madeline's disappearance, arranged chronologically and annotated with handwritten notes. "Why would he keep these?" Chen asked, photographing each clipping. "Could be innocuous. A teacher concerned about his student," Dominguez replied, though his expression suggested he believed otherwise. "Or it could be a trophy collection. Let's bag it for evidence." Their search of the cabin might have ended there if not for Officer Watts' persistence. As the youngest member of the team, she was often assigned the least glamorous tasks. Today, that meant checking the plumbing fixtures and utility connections. "Detective, you need to see this," she called from outside. Watts had opened the access panel to the cabin's water heater and found something unexpected, a second electrical panel that didn't connect to the cabin's main power supply. "It's running to somewhere else on the property," she explained, tracing the conduit that disappeared into the ground. "And it's drawing significant power, way more than this cabin would need." Dominguez radioed Dr. Reyes, who redirected her team to follow the underground conduit with the radar equipment. The electrical line ran straight toward the area where they had already detected thermal anomalies. By mid-morning, the radar had mapped what appeared to be a structure beneath the surface, approximately 12 feet square and 7 feet deep, with an access point camouflaged by a seemingly natural rock formation. "It's constructed like a storm shelter," Dr. Reyes said, showing Dominguez the radar images. "But the thermal signature suggests it's actively climate-controlled." Dominguez approached the rock formation, which now revealed itself as an expertly disguised hatch. Heavy and counterweighted, it opened to reveal a concrete staircase descending into darkness. The detective switched on his flashlight and led the way down, weapon drawn as a precaution. What they discovered below defied their expectations. Instead of a crude hiding place, they found a fully equipped laboratory, stainless steel countertops, specialized ventilation, and advanced chemical storage units. One wall held a computer workstation with multiple monitors. Another displayed academic certificates and chemistry awards bearing Pierce's name. "This is a professional setup," said Dominguez, carefully photographing the space. "Far beyond what someone would build for a hobby." Forensic technicians catalogued the chemicals present. Many were standard for chemistry instruction, but others were more concerning. Chemicals that could be used to break down organic matter, remove DNA evidence, or alter physical evidence. The computer was password protected, but IT specialists from the department were able to bypass the security. The hard drive contained years of meticulous notes, some related to legitimate research, others documenting what appeared to be experimental procedures with no clear scientific purpose. Most disturbing was a folder labeled simply MT, Madeline Taylor's initials. Inside were photographs of the girl that went beyond those of a teacher documenting class activities. There were images taken from a distance, Madeline walking home, studying at the library, even sitting in her backyard. The timestamps showed a pattern of surveillance stretching back months before her disappearance. As the team processed the underground lab, the cadaver dogs arrived with their handlers. They began their methodical search of the property, focusing on the areas with disturbed soil that the radar had identified. Within 30 minutes, both dogs alerted at the same location, a spot approximately 50 yards from the hidden laboratory entrance. The soil there appeared undisturbed to the naked eye, but the ground-penetrating radar had shown anomalies consistent with excavation and refilling. Dominguez made the difficult decision to begin excavation. "Proceed with extreme care," he instructed the team. "Document everything and treat the entire area as a potential crime scene." As they carefully removed layers of soil, Officer Chen discovered the first piece of physical evidence, a bracelet with a small silver charm in the shape of a telescope. Dominguez immediately recognized it from the case file. Madeline's mother had described this exact bracelet as a gift for her daughter's 16th birthday, a nod to her interest in astronomy. The excavation continued with renewed urgency, but maintained careful precision. 3 feet down, they uncovered fabric, the remains of what appeared to be a red jacket, the same one Madeline had been wearing when she left the library that October evening in 2015. By late afternoon, their worst fears were confirmed. The team had uncovered human remains, carefully wrapped in plastic and buried beneath a layer of lime, a substance that accelerates decomposition while neutralizing odors. Dominguez stepped away from the excavation site, the weight of the discovery settling heavily on his shoulders. He called Lieutenant Keller with the update, then made the decision to bring Devon Pierce in for questioning immediately, before news of the search could reach him. "Have the school resource officer detain him discreetly," Dominguez instructed. "No handcuffs, no scene, just say there's been a situation at his cabin and we need his assistance." As the forensic team continued their work at the Lake Travis property, collecting evidence that would eventually build an irrefutable case, Dominguez prepared for what would be the most important interrogation of his career. Pierce was brought to the station under the pretense of helping with an investigation. He appeared calm but curious as he was led to an interview room, the same room where he had been briefly questioned years earlier about his missing student. "There seems to be some confusion," Pierce said, as Dominguez entered the room. "The officer mentioned something about my cabin. Has there been a break-in?" Dominguez sat across from Pierce, studying the man who had hidden behind a facade of respectability for so long. "We executed a search warrant on your Lake Travis property today, Mr. Pierce. We found some things that require explanation." Pierce's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in his shoulders. "I don't understand. What could possibly warrant searching my private property?" Instead of answering, Dominguez placed a photograph of the underground laboratory on the table between them. "Perhaps you could start by explaining this." The color drained from Pierce's face as he stared at the image. In that moment, Detective Dominguez knew they had finally found the truth that had remained buried for over 7 years, a truth that would bring long-awaited answers to the Taylor family and shake the Pinewood Springs community to its core. Devon Pierce stared at the photograph of his underground laboratory, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. For nearly 20 seconds, he said nothing, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the image as if confirming its reality. "That's private research space," he finally said, his voice steady but noticeably quieter. "Nothing illegal about a teacher conducting independent scientific work." Detective Dominguez nodded slightly. "Independent research requiring reinforced concrete walls, specialized ventilation, and an elaborate camouflage system? That seems excessive for hobby science." Pierce leaned back, crossing his arms. "I value my privacy. The academic world can be competitive, and I've had ideas stolen before." A hint of indignation crept into his voice. "I built that lab with my own hands, my own money. It's not a crime to create a secure workspace." Dominguez had interrogated enough suspects to recognize this strategy, acknowledge what can't be denied, while establishing an innocent explanation. He decided to change tactics. "Let's talk about October 12, 2015, the detective said, opening a folder. "You told Detective Morales you were at school preparing for a board meeting from 5:30 p.m. until the meeting began at 6:30, and that you remained there until after 9 p.m. Pierce nodded. "That's correct. It's in the official record. We've reviewed the cell tower data from your phone that evening," Dominguez continued, sliding another document across the table. "Your phone pinged towers in a pattern showing movement from the school toward the library area around 6:40 p.m., then west out of town before returning to the school by 7:25. The change in Pierce was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening of his jaw, a momentary flutter of his eyelids. "I don't recall my exact movements that day. It was 8 years ago. Perhaps I ran an errand before the meeting." "An errand near the library? where Madeline Taylor was last seen at 6:43 p.m. Pierce's expression hardened. "Are you implying something, Detective? Because if you are, I think I should have my attorney present." "That's your right," Dominguez acknowledged. "But before you make that call, there's something else you should know." He placed another photograph on the table, this one showing the excavation site behind Pierce's cabin. "We found human remains on your property today. Preliminary examination suggests they've been there approximately 7 to 8 years. The blood drained from Pierce's face. His hand, reaching for the photograph, trembled visibly. That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "We also found this," Dominguez added, placing an evidence bag containing the silver telescope charm bracelet on the table. Mrs. Taylor confirmed it belonged to her daughter. Pierce pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I want my lawyer, now." Dominguez gathered the photographs and documents. "Of course, but while we wait, we'll be continuing our search of your lab. The forensic team is particularly interested in a password-protected folder on your computer labeled MT." As Pierce was led to a holding cell to await his attorney, Dominguez returned to the station's incident room, where the evidence from the Lake Travis property was being catalogued and analyzed. The preliminary findings were disturbing in their thoroughness. Dr. Reyes had overseen the careful excavation and transportation of the remains to the medical examiner's office, where DNA testing would officially confirm what they already suspected, that they had found Madeline Taylor. But it was the laboratory that told the more complex story. "His setup was sophisticated," explained Dr. Kai Nakamura, the forensic chemist assigned to the case, far beyond what you'd expect from a high school teacher, even one with an advanced degree. The lab contained equipment for various chemical processes, including acid digestion systems, specialized filtration devices, and an autoclave for sterilization. Most concerning were the chemicals themselves, compounds that could destroy organic material, neutralize DNA, and eliminate trace evidence. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Dr. Nakamura continued. "This wasn't improvised, it was methodical. The ventilation system was designed to prevent any odors from escaping. The waste disposal was self-contained. He even had a custom water filtration system to ensure no trace chemicals left the property." The computer from Pierce's underground lab had been transported to the digital forensics unit, where technicians worked to access its encrypted contents. By evening, they had broken through the security measures and discovered the full extent of Pierce's obsession. The MT folder contained hundreds of photographs of Madeline taken over an 18-month period before her disappearance. Many were captured through windows or from a distance, clearly without her knowledge. There were detailed notes about her schedule, her habits, even transcripts of conversations Pierce had secretly recorded during their after-class discussions. Most disturbing were the journal entries, meticulously dated records of Pierce's growing fixation. The earliest entries described a special student with exceptional promise. Over time, the language shifted, becoming more personal, more possessive. He wrote about feeling a unique connection that was beyond the typical teacher-student relationship. In entries from the summer before Madeline's senior year, Pierce described his frustration that she would soon leave for college. "She doesn't understand how much she needs guidance, protection. The world will crush someone as pure as Madeline. I alone recognize her true potential." The final entries from October 2015 were the most chilling. On October 11th, the day before Madeline's disappearance, Pierce wrote, "Tomorrow is the day, everything is prepared. When she understands what I've done for her, the sacrifices I've made, she'll see that this is the only way forward for both of us." There was no entry for October 12th, the day Madeline disappeared, but on October 13th, a single line. It wasn't supposed to end that way. The forensic team also discovered a second hidden compartment in the laboratory containing personal items belonging to Madeline, her cell phone, several notebooks, and the purple backpack seen in the anonymous tip's photograph. The backpack contained school materials and a college application essay Madeline had been working on. By the time Pierce's attorney arrived at the station, the evidence against his client was overwhelming. DNA testing would later confirm that blood residue found on equipment in the laboratory matched Madeline's profile, and soil samples from the burial site contained chemical traces consistent with compounds found in the lab. Meanwhile, Detective Dominguez faced a lingering question. Who had sent the anonymous tip that broke the case open? The letter and photograph had been processed for fingerprints and DNA, but no matches were found in any database. The paper and envelope were common types available at any office supply store. The postmark showed it had been mailed from Austin, approximately 30 miles from Pinewood Springs. The following morning, as news of Pierce's arrest began to spread through the community, Dominguez received a call from the front desk. A man had arrived at the station asking to speak with him, Xavier Linwood, former security guard at Pinewood Springs High School. "I have information about the Pierce case," Linwood said, his voice unsteady. "I should have come forward years ago, but I was afraid and ashamed." Dominguez led him to an interview room, sensing this might be the missing piece of the puzzle. "Take your time, Mr. Linwood. Why don't you start by telling me where you were working in October 2015? Linwood's hands fidgeted nervously on the table. "I was head of security at the high school. I'd been there about 5 years at that point. I knew everyone, staff, most of the students. I knew Devon Pierce pretty well, or I thought I did." "And how were you connected to Madeline Taylor's disappearance?" Linwood took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight pressed down on him. "I didn't know what he'd done to her, not at first, but I helped him afterward. I helped him cover it up." As Linwood began to detail his involvement, Detective Dominguez realized they were finally unraveling the complete truth of what had happened on that October evening in 2015, a truth that would prove even more disturbing than they had imagined. Xavier Linwood sat hunched in the interview room, his large frame seeming to collapse in on itself as the weight of his confession pressed down on him. Once the head of security at Pinewood Springs High School, he now worked as a night watchman at a storage facility in Austin. A significant step down professionally, but a deliberate choice, he explained, to remove himself from environments with young people. "I've lived with this for 8 years, Linwood began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every night I see her face. Every day I think about what I could have done differently." Detective Dominguez set up the recording equipment and read Linwood his rights, explaining that while he wasn't under arrest, his statement could potentially lead to criminal charges. Linwood nodded, signing the acknowledgement form with a trembling hand. "I want it on record," he insisted. "All of it." According to Linwood, his involvement began on the evening of October 12, 2015, the night Madeline disappeared. He had been working late, conducting a routine security check of the school buildings before the board meeting. Around 7:15 p.m. he received a call from Devon Pierce. He sounded panicked, Linwood recalled. "Said he needed my help, that there had been an accident at his cabin. I'd been to his place once before for a faculty barbecue, so I knew where it was. He begged me not to call anyone else. Said it would ruin his career even if it was just an accident." Linwood drove directly to the Lake Travis property, arriving around 8 p.m. Pierce met him at the end of the gravel driveway, disheveled and agitated. When I asked what happened, he told me that Madeline Taylor had come to his cabin to discuss a special science project. He claimed they argued about her college applications, that he thought she was making a mistake choosing astronomy over chemistry. He said she got upset, tried to leave, and fell down the stairs outside his cabin. Linwood paused, swallowing hard. "He took me inside. She was on the floor, not moving. I checked for a pulse, but there wasn't one. I wanted to call an ambulance anyway, but Pierce was frantic, saying it was too late, that it would look like something else had happened." "Did you believe his story?" Dominguez asked. Linwood shook his head slowly. "Not entirely. The positioning didn't make sense for a fall. And there was something in his eyes, a look I'd never seen before, but I'd known him for years. He was respected, admired. I couldn't process that he might have, that he would. So, what did you do?" "I helped him," Linwood admitted, his voice breaking. "God helped me. I helped him. He said he had a place to bury her on his property, a spot no one would find. I helped him wrap her body and carry it outside. I even helped dig the grave." Linwood described how Pierce had already prepared chemicals, lime and other substances, to accelerate decomposition. He knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't impulsive. He had everything ready. That's when I started to realize this wasn't an accident, but by then, I was already involved. After they buried Madeline's body, Pierce paid Linwood $10,000 in cash. He said it was for my silence, for helping with a terrible accident. I took it. I told myself I needed it. My wife had medical bills, my son was starting college. But the truth is, I took it because I was already an accomplice. Dominguez pressed for more details. "Did you know about the underground laboratory?" Linwood looked genuinely surprised. "Laboratory? No, there was just the cabin when I was there. But he did have a locked room he wouldn't let me enter. Said it was personal storage." "What about afterward? Did Pierce ever mention Madeline again?" "Not directly, but about a month later, he asked me to dispose of her backpack. Said the police might search his house eventually, and he couldn't risk having it there. I threw it in Lake Travis, weighted down with rocks. Linwood paused. At least I told him I did, but I couldn't go through with it. I kept it hidden in my attic, thinking maybe someday I'd find the courage to come forward. And did you send the anonymous letter to the sheriff's department in January? Linwood nodded slowly. When I saw Pierce win that educator award last year, something broke inside me. He was being celebrated while Madeline's family still had no closure. I couldn't live with it anymore, but I was too cowardly to come forward directly. I have a family, and I was afraid of going to prison. So why come in now? I saw the news this morning. When I realized you'd found the evidence, I knew it was time. My wife encouraged me. She's known something was eating at me for years, though I never told her what. Linwood looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but resolute. I'm ready to face the consequences. Dominguez continued the interview for another 2 hours, extracting every detail Linwood could recall about that night and any subsequent interactions with Pierce. The information he provided corroborated much of what they had already discovered, but added crucial context about Pierce's state of mind and premeditation. After the interview concluded, Dominguez consulted with the district attorney's office. Linwood was charged as an accessory after the fact, but in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony against Pierce, the prosecution agreed to recommend a reduced sentence. With Linwood's confession, the final pieces of the case fell into place. The forensic evidence from Pierce's laboratory, combined with the eyewitness testimony, created an irrefutable timeline of what had happened to Madeline Taylor. According to the medical examiner's report, Madeline had died from blunt force trauma to the head, inconsistent with a fall downstairs, but consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Trace evidence suggested the murder weapon might have been a specialized piece of laboratory equipment, a reinforced mortar used for grinding chemical samples. The DNA analysis confirmed what they had suspected. The remains found on Pierce's property were indeed Madeline Taylor's. Her parents, who had never given up hope of finding their daughter, received the devastating news with a complex mixture of grief and relief. The uncertainty that had haunted them for years was finally resolved, though in the most heartbreaking way possible. As news of the arrest and the grisly discoveries spread through Pinewood Springs, the community struggled to reconcile the beloved teacher they thought they knew with the monster who had stalked, murdered, and buried a student. Former students came forward with stories that, in retrospect, revealed warning signs. Pierce's intense interest in certain female students, his insistence on one-on-one mentoring sessions, his obvious favoritism. The school district launched an internal investigation, examining how Pierce had managed to conceal his obsession for so long. Early findings suggested a systematic failure of oversight. Concerns had been raised over the years, but Pierce's academic credentials and popularity had shielded him from serious scrutiny. Meanwhile, Detective Dominguez prepared for what would likely be a high-profile trial. The evidence against Pierce was overwhelming, but the prosecution wanted to ensure every detail was meticulously documented. They couldn't risk any procedural errors that might allow him to escape justice. 2 weeks after Pierce's arrest, while being held without bail in the county detention center, he requested a meeting with his attorney and the district attorney. Through his lawyer, he indicated a willingness to plead guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The district attorney consulted with the Taylor family, who ultimately supported accepting the plea. They had no desire to endure a lengthy trial that would expose every painful detail of their daughter's final moments. More importantly, they wanted to ensure Pierce would never have the opportunity to harm another young person. On March 15, 2023, Devon Pierce appeared in court to enter his plea. The man who stood before Judge Spencer Kendrick bore little resemblance to the confident educator who had charmed the community for years. His shoulders slumped, his prison jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame. He spoke barely above a whisper as he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Before accepting the plea, Judge Kendrick asked Pierce if he wished to make a statement. Pierce declined, staring at the floor as the judge proceeded to describe the crime as heinous and calculated, betraying the sacred trust between teacher and student. As the bailiff led Pierce away to begin his life sentence without the possibility of parole, Detective Dominguez watched from the gallery, his expression solemn. The case had been solved, but there was no sense of triumph, only the somber recognition that justice, while finally served, had come far too late for Madeline Taylor. The conviction of Devon Pierce sent ripples through the American education system far beyond the borders of Pinewood Springs. By June 2023, 3 months after Pierce began serving his life sentence at the Pulaski unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the case had become a focal point for national discussions about school safety, faculty oversight, and the systems that had failed to protect Madeleine Taylor. On a warm Saturday morning, Detective Raul Dominguez stood before a small gathering at Pinewood Springs Memorial Park. The Taylor family had organized a dedication ceremony for a bench installed in Madeleine's honor, overlooking a garden of native Texas wildflowers. The detective had been invited to speak, an unusual request, but one he felt compelled to honor. "Justice delayed is not the same as justice denied," Dominguez began, "but it carries its own weight of regret. For 8 years, Madeleine's truth remained buried while her family lived in agonizing uncertainty. For 8 years, the man responsible for her death continued teaching, mentoring, and being celebrated by a community unaware of his true nature." The audience, comprised of the Taylors, their friends, former classmates of Madeleine, and several officers who had worked on the case, listened in solemn silence. As investigators, we're trained to follow evidence, to trust facts over instincts, but sometimes the evidence isn't where we first look, or we fail to recognize its significance. Dominguez glanced toward Robert Taylor, Madeleine's father, whose health had deteriorated drastically during the years of not knowing his daughter's fate. Now confined to a wheelchair and requiring oxygen, he had lived long enough to see his daughter's killer brought to justice, a small mercy in an ocean of injustice. The resolution of Madeleine's case has taught us painful lessons about vigilance, about questioning what seems certain, and about the courage it takes to speak truth, even years after the fact. After the ceremony, Dominguez spoke privately with Catherine Taylor, Madeleine's mother. Since the discovery of her daughter's remains, she had channeled her grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation to strengthen background checks for educators and create better reporting systems for concerning behavior. "The school board voted unanimously to implement our recommended protocols," she told Dominguez. "They're calling it the Madeleine Taylor Safety Initiative. Every teacher will undergo enhanced screening, and anonymous reporting channels will be available to students and parents." "That's a significant achievement," Dominguez replied. "It won't bring Madeleine back, but it might prevent another family from experiencing what yours has endured." Catherine nodded, her eyes reflecting both determination and exhaustion. "The hardest part has been learning how many small signs were missed. A teacher who showed excessive interest in a student, requests for private meetings, the subtle isolation from peers. None of it seemed alarming in isolation, but together." Her voice trailed off. The detective understood what she couldn't say aloud. The pattern had been there, but no one had connected the dots until it was too late. Meanwhile, at the Harris County Sheriff's Department, the case had prompted a comprehensive review of cold case handling procedures. Lieutenant Keller had instituted new protocols for reassessing dormant cases, ensuring that advances in technology and forensic techniques would be systematically applied to unsolved crimes. "The Taylor case exposed gaps in our methodology," Keller acknowledged during a departmental briefing. "We relied too heavily on initial assessments and alibis that weren't thoroughly verified. Moving forward, all cold cases will undergo mandatory re-evaluation every 18 months, with particular attention to technological advances that might yield new insights." The anonymous letter that had broken the case open now served as a training example for new detectives, a reminder that significant leads could come from unexpected sources, even years after a crime. Xavier Linwood's cooperation had resulted in a reduced sentence of 8 years for accessory after the fact, with eligibility for parole after serving 4. His testimony had been crucial in understanding the full scope of Pierce's crime and his careful efforts to conceal it. In a statement read at his sentencing, Linwood had expressed profound remorse, acknowledging that his silence had allowed Pierce to remain in a position of authority over vulnerable young people for years after Madeleine's murder. "I will never forgive myself," his statement concluded. "No punishment the court can impose will equal the weight I carry for not speaking up sooner." As part of a restorative justice program, Linwood had agreed to record an educational video for law enforcement and school security personnel, detailing how his initial decision to help cover up a supposed accident had spiraled into years of complicity. The video emphasized the importance of reporting suspicious circumstances immediately, regardless of the status or reputation of those involved. The hidden laboratory beneath Pierce's cabin had been thoroughly documented and studied before being demolished by order of the court. The sophisticated setup had revealed Pierce's methodical planning and his knowledge of forensic techniques, knowledge he had used to conceal evidence and mislead investigators. The chemicals and equipment found there suggested he had researched how to eliminate DNA evidence and accelerate decomposition, indicating premeditation far beyond what was needed for an accidental death. Most disturbing were the journals recovered from the laboratory, spanning nearly 5 years, and detailing Pierce's growing obsession with Madeleine and several other female students before her. The earliest entries showed a teacher who initially seemed genuinely concerned with fostering academic talent, but gradually revealed a man who believed he had special insight into his students' lives and potential, insight that gave him the right to make decisions for them. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the journals identified a pattern of narcissistic delusion, in which Pierce cast himself as a misunderstood genius whose special connection with certain students justified increasingly controlling behavior. His fixation on Madeleine had intensified when she began applying to universities that would take her far from Texas, a development he characterized in his writings as abandonment and ingratitude. The final entries suggested that Pierce had planned to keep Madeleine at his property for an extended period, forcing her to recognize his guidance as necessary for her future. The murder appeared to have been impulsive, the result of her resistance rather than his original intent, but his preparations for disposing of evidence had been anything but impulsive. In August 2023, the Texas Education Agency completed its investigation into the Pinewood Springs School District's handling of the case. The report identified multiple instances where concerns about Pierce's behavior had been raised, but dismissed or minimized. A former school counselor had noted Pierce's unusual interest in tracking certain female students' schedules. A parent had questioned the appropriateness of after-hours mentoring sessions. A colleague had reported overhearing Pierce making comments about a student's appearance. None of these reports had been properly documented or escalated. The district superintendent had resigned in the wake of the scandal, acknowledging systemic failures in oversight and accountability. The most profound impact, however, was felt by the students who had passed through Pierce's classroom over his 15-year career at Pinewood Springs High School. Many struggled to reconcile their positive memories of an engaging teacher with the reality of his crimes. Support groups formed organically, both in person and online, as former students processed their complicated emotions: guilt for not noticing warning signs, relief that they hadn't become targets themselves, and betrayal by someone they had trusted and admired. One former student, Eliza Harmon, who had graduated 2 years before Madeleine's disappearance, published an essay that went viral on social media. Titled "The Mentor Who Wasn't," it detailed subtle boundary violations and uncomfortable interactions that in retrospect revealed Pierce's pattern of testing limits with students he found special. "He made us feel chosen," Harmon wrote. "Being singled out for his attention was like receiving validation of your intellectual worth. Only years later did I realize how he used that dynamic to normalize behavior that should have raised red flags. The personal questions, the insistence on private conversations, the subtle undermining of other authority figures in our lives." Harmon's essay sparked a national conversation about the warning signs of educator misconduct and the responsibility of institutions to create environments where students felt empowered to report concerning behavior without fear of dismissal or ridicule. By September 2023, almost exactly 8 years after Madeleine Taylor's disappearance, her case had become a catalyst for change across multiple systems: law enforcement, education, and community oversight. Textbooks on criminal justice now included the Pierce case as a study in how perpetrators with community standing could exploit their positions to both commit crimes and evade detection. For Detective Dominguez, the case represented both his greatest professional achievement and a sobering reminder of the limitations of traditional investigative approaches. On the anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance, he placed flowers at her memorial bench, reflecting on how a single anonymous letter had finally broken open a case that conventional methods had failed to solve. "We build our investigations on the foundation of evidence," he later told a class of recruits at the police academy. But sometimes justice depends on the courage of individuals willing to speak uncomfortable truths, even years after the fact. Our job is to create systems that make that courage less necessary and less rare.